Guys. Today we're going to talk about the Reconstruction period. This is going to get pretty in depth, and it's definitely going to set up a lot of policies in that are going to shape, especially the South, but the United States for the next 100 or so years. So, pretty important time period right here we're going to talk about. Okay, so Reconstruction. Just FYI, anything red, even if it's not underlined, needs to be highlighted in your notes. Okay, so anything red. So Reconstruction. This is a period lasting from 1865 to 1877, in which the U.S. rebuilt the country politically, economically, and socially after the destruction of the Civil War. Okay, so this is this time period where we're going to reshape what we think the country should look like. Okay. So after the war, so there's three big issues after the war that basically needed to be handled. First one is what should be done to the Southerners who rebelled. Second one is how should the Confederate States be readmitted to the United States, and what should be done with the newly freed slaves. Okay, so all these three were the big questions about what should be done. Okay, so what are we going to do? And that's basically answering these questions is going to be the biggest challenge of Reconstruction. So, possible solutions to the plans. So Johnson's plan, he, like Lincoln, wanted a mild plan to reunite the country quickly. Okay, so he did not see a whole lot of value in really punishing the southern states for what happened. So in his plan, he said that Southern white males, except for the high officials, would regain full citizenship by taking a simple oath pledging their loyalty to the Union. So what that meant is just normal citizens. All they had to do was say, I promise not to do that again, and I'll behave, and I'm very loyal to the United States, and that's it. And then they're a citizen again. When 10% of the Confederate States voters took the oath, then the state was allowed to form a new government. So each of these new states would have to draft a new constitution. Okay? And then Congress proposed and passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, so that ended slavery. Okay? In all parts of the country. So not just like the Emancipation Proclamation was just the states of open rebellion. The 13th Amendment is across all of the United States, no more slavery. And then Congress also is going to organize the Freedmen's Bureau, and this was designed to help the newly freed slaves, the African Americans, to find jobs and protect their rights. And they're also going to establish hospitals and schools for them. Okay, so they're going to basically help them to recover from the atrocities of the past. The radical Republicans, or the congressional plan, was much different. So their main goal was they wanted to protect the rights of the African Americans and the loyal whites in the South, but they really, really wanted to punish the South. Okay, so first thing on there was punish rebels by confiscating their land. So if you fought for the Confederacy, if you were just a normal guy who fought for the Confederacy and you owned a farm, which many of them did, then you would get that taken away. Okay? They also wanted to replace the existing political leaders in the South. Okay, so any of, like Jefferson Davis, for example, was the president of the Confederacy. Anybody who was in a part of the Confederate government had to be replaced. They were not allowed to be in government in the states or in Congress or anywhere in the federal government. They also demanded that states ratify the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment is going to give all men citizenship regardless of color. So basically the 14th Amendment says it doesn't matter what color you are, you can be a citizen. Okay, and it's also going to create a they're also going to create a constitution that gave all men the right to vote before readmitting them to the Union. So they're dictating what they have to say in their state constitutions. And then finally, they're going to use the military to maintain control and to enforce African American voting rights. So there's 10 states that hadn't ratified the 14th Amendment. Those guys were all divided into 5 military districts, and I'll show you that in a second. But these 5 military districts were where the federal troops were enforce these new laws. Okay, so just FYI, so there's 3 what we call Reconstruction amendments. So they go in order of each other. It's really simple. So the 13th Amendment says no more slavery. 14th Amendment says, like it says on here, doesn't matter what color you are, you're a citizen now. And then 15th Amendment says all citizens can vote. Okay, so that's what the military is there to protect those voting rights. Okay, so this right here is the military districts. Okay, so you can see that there were 5 military districts, and then these were these states in which they were occupied by the northern troops. Okay. All right. So responses by Southern whites to Johnson's plan. So they didn't like Johnson's plan too much because the Southern whites felt like that plan was even harsh on them, despite the radical Republicans' plan was much harsher. But they're going to pass black codes, what were known as black codes. These were basically laws that were passed to limit African Americans' rights. So they were forced to sign contracts to work for a full year. It allowed whites to whip black workers. It limited freedom of speech and travel, denied the right to vote. It allowed states to put unemployed blacks in jail and prevented blacks from testifying against whites in courts. So a lot of these laws were super violating of the rights of these newly freed slaves. And then another thing they did was they founded a secret organization known as the Ku Klux Klan. So they did this in order to maintain white supremacy in the South, and the KKK was known for using threats and violence in order to get people to do what they want. And they wore white robes to intimidate blacks with the spirits of the Confederate dead. So they were considered the spirits of all those dead soldiers that fought for the Confederacy. Okay, so the effects of the congressional plan. Blacks, carpetbaggers. Okay, so carpetbaggers were the northerners who moved south to make profit. So they were people who moved down and to try to take advantage to make a profit. And then you have the scalawags. Scalawags are the southerners who either opposed secession or now wanted to cooperate with the North. So they were considered almost treasonous to the South. So the blacks, the carpetbaggers, and the scalawags joined together to give the Republican Party control of all southern state governments. And many whites couldn't stand to be considered equal to African Americans, so they often attacked blacks and their white supporters. Okay, and a lot of that was done through the KKK. Okay, so overall effects of Reconstruction. So there's a couple of achievements, and then there's a lot of failures. So the achievements would be that all states were restored to the Union. They do establish a public school system. And then the 14th and 15th Amendments became the basis for what will be the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Okay, so that's in the 20th century. So that's MLK, Malcolm X, those guys leading that. Okay, so those 14th and 15th Amendments basically guaranteed citizenship, like I said, and right to vote. And so that was the basis of basically those guys were trying to regain those and trying to overturn a lot of what will be known as Jim Crow laws. Okay, so the failures. Notice there's a lot more of these. So the failures would be that one is most slaves could not afford their own land. And so what they ended up doing is they continued to work for the cotton planters in what would be known as a sharecropping type of situation. The South was very slow to expand its economy, and it became the poorest section of the U.S. It still continues to be. If you ever drive through like rural Mississippi or Alabama, it's almost like being in a third world country in some of those places. So it's very, very poor. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that they just didn't advance technologically like the North did. Okay, so there weren't as many jobs readily available, and in a lot of cases, a lot of historians have blamed that slavery in the long run hurt their economy more than it ended up helping it. But that's kind of a debate that historians often have. Blacks eventually lost all of their rights gained under the Republicans. So part of these black codes were things like poll tax. So means that you would have to, in order to vote, you have to pay a tax. But if or you would have to pass like a reading test, and most newly freed slaves didn't know how to read. So sometimes they would do stuff like that. And then what they would do is, if there were some like poor white farmers who didn't know how to read and couldn't afford a poll tax, they could still vote because they were grandfathered in. So they had what was called the grandfather clause. So basically, if your grandfather or any ancestor had voted on or before January 1st, 1867, then you could vote. You didn't have to pay the poll tax. You were basically exempt from those things. Well, the African Americans couldn't vote. They didn't qualify for the grandfather clause because they didn't have those rights yet. Okay, that wasn't part of the Constitution. They weren't allowed to vote. They were still slaves. So that kind of hurt them in that regard. And then the Jim Crow laws, basically the black codes have ended up becoming the Jim Crow laws, but these basically encourage segregation in housing, transportation facilities, public accommodations, and schools. And we'll get more into the separate but equal doctrine that Plessy versus Ferguson is going to create. But basically, somebody sued somebody else about accommodations, and the Supreme Court decided that segregation's okay as long as it's separate but equal. Okay, well, separate was never equal, and so that basically is a symbol for the Jim Crow laws. And then the South turned against the Republicans and overwhelmingly voted Democrat, creating what was known as the Solid South. So what that meant is that the South was very, very blue. Okay, they voted Democrat because the Democrats were the ones who supported slavery at the time. The Republicans were the abolitionist party, and they didn't support that. Okay, so Reconstruction, just FYI, Reconstruction is going to end, and you might want to write this in the margins of your notes somewhere or underneath. But Reconstruction is going to end with the Compromise of 1877. Okay, so basically what's going to happen there is Rutherford B. Hayes is going to be elected president, but he's not going to have quite enough electoral votes. So because he's Republican and the South, like I said, voted for Democrat, well, Hayes is going to be elected and become president because there was a compromise that if the South says it's okay for Hayes to be president, then they'll remove troops from the South, and that basically ends Reconstruction. So that's why it goes to 1877. Okay? All right. I hope you guys all have a wonderful day, and don't forget to do your processor.